of the Scottish Parliament are expected to hold a final vote tonight on legislation aimed at simplifying and speeding up the process for trans people to change their legally recognised gender. Young people, aged 16 and 17, are expected to be allowed to change their gender after the Scottish Government rejected moves to keep the minimum age at 18. But the bill has proved highly divisive, even within parties. We're going to speak to Maren Smith, who's a member of the For Women Scotland campaign group, who opposed the bill and also a spokesperson for the Heal Survivors group. And we're also joined in studio by Karen McShane, who's a trans woman living in Belfast. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Chris.
Karen, if we start with you, just explain why you support this legislation, because at the moment, it does take a process of going through in order to change your gender, but you can do it. Why is this legislation, do you think, a step forward?
Well, Chris, the Gender Recognition Act was introduced in 2005. At that time, we didn't have a government, so it was adopted in Northern Ireland as part of the whole UK provision. For that, what that allows somebody to do is to transition to the gender that they believe they should have been from birth. But it's a very, very long process. So what we're finding here, in particularly in Northern Ireland, is that there's a 5-year waiting list to get in to see somebody to go through the process. In Scotland, the process is slightly different because the Equality Act in 2010 was adopted, and that allows people to self-declare, for want of a better description, if they believe that this is something that's going to be a full and permanent change. That legislation wasn't adopted here in Northern Ireland, so we're slightly different. When you look at the process, at the minute it's over 18s. So you have to be an adult to go through that particular process. But we all go through puberty as teenagers. We all go through that early. And my thoughts on this process is the people that are objecting are really objecting to trans women as opposed to trans men. There's a lot of trans men in the community, but because they've gone through a process of taking hormones, it thickens their vocal cords, they grow a beard, and you wouldn't know for any other purpose that they were a trans man. My voice is still quite deep, so people recognise me as being a trans woman, and there's a little bit of discrimination against trans women rather than men.
Would just explain what difference it makes to you to be recognised as female as opposed to male. What is the difference to you? What does it make to you that makes you feel like more complete? Is that the right word? I don't know.
That's a good word. When I went through my process, I grew up in a situation where it was illegal to be in a same-sex relationship in Northern Ireland. So a lot of gay people were hiding in the cupboard. Trans wasn't even being talked about. Yet when I went to school at just the age of 3.5, with my sister and my female cousin, they were whisked off to one side. I was whisked off to another to play football with the boys. And I'm sitting going, hold on a minute. I should be over there. And for me, that was the first real marker in my life that something was different. Having a process that is allowing people to come through a little bit earlier really allows you to have peace of mind. The way I would describe it, I grew up as if there was a balloon in my head. And every day there was a little bit of pressure added into that. And it just kept building and building and building. And there was no escape. And I knew that there was something different. I didn't know as a teenager what it was. And it was only in my later life when I read a lot more things and went through lots of medical consultations, I realised what was going on in my life. And ever since then, when I went through that process, it's as if the whole world had been lifted off my shoulders and I was released to be the person that I was.
Maren Smith, when you listen to that's somebody who has felt the benefit of having their legally recognised gender changed. Why do you object to this bill that would make that easier?
We object to the removal of all safeguards. The Equality Act doesn't actually have anything to do at all with changing your sex legally. I just wanted to correct that. Now, obviously, the situation in Northern Ireland is a little bit different, but in Scotland, the Gender Recognition Act 2004 requires an applicant to show that they have a medical need to be legally recognised as the opposite sex. And when you apply for a gender recognition certificate, you gain significant new rights that you do not have without this, which a 2021 court case in Northern Ireland and, of course, our recent judgment in court in Scotland has confirmed that this is the case. So when I think about the fact that at the moment there's 1% of the population, an estimated 1% of the population, with a proven need, a medical need to transition, who can apply for a GRC. We are now talking about changing that to 100% of the population above the age of 16, removing all safeguards.
Of course, the argument would be that 100% of people are not going to want to change their gender. But what are the rights that?
But anyone who chooses to can, and our argument is that this opens up the door to bad actors, if you want, who are, and we hasten to add that, not identifying as trans. Simply anybody can use that process to legally change their sex.
So explain that. That's what I was really getting at by asking what the concerns about rights are. What are your concerns about people gaining which rights? What is the worry here?
So the worry is that at the moment there is a material difference between someone who identifies as trans but remains legally male and someone who identifies as trans but has legally changed their sex. This is what the two court cases that I just referenced, the judgment in Northern Ireland in 21 and the judgment just now in Scotland, have confirmed that the gender recognition certificate grants you access rights to single-sex spaces and services that you do not have without a GRC.
So that's concern about toilets and changing rooms. It's those kind of things that you worry about.
Well, we worry about. We actually worry about a lot more than just toilets and changing rooms. We worry about services such as healthcare, social care, and rape crisis counselling services, women's refuges. We worry about. Of course, we worry about the rising number of girls who are seeking to identify out of womanhood for a whole number of reasons, some of which have to do with sexual violence. We're also talking about women's awards, women's scholarships, any positive measures that aim to redress the historic or existing discrimination.
Well, let's let Karen respond to some of that, and you and Karen can have a conversation about this, because Karen, yes, that is a worry and a fear about people getting access to women-only spaces. It's a concern.
Can I just add, it's not just a worry and a fear. We have lived experience of this happening.
Okay, Karen?
I think just to pick up on Marian's concerns, she's right. She's obviously got concerns for females. I have concerns going into all male spaces or all female spaces, because if you look at me, you can't really see on the radio, but going into a male toilet for me would be something that's very, very difficult. Not that I would, but let's put this into context, Chris. Since the gender recognition certificate was issued, the statistics that I've received up to about the year 2020 show that there's just under 7,000 people in the UK that have received a gender recognition certificate. In Northern Ireland, up to 2020, that figure was 90. So when we're talking about 1% of the population or more, these are people that have taken a serious decision in their life. Now,
Okay, but let's address some of what Maren said there as well, though. She has got concerns about some people being put in more vulnerable places. And one of the concerns and conversations had last night involved sex offenders. That was a conversation that was had in the Scottish Parliament last night, you might have seen, where it was decided in the vote that convicted sex offenders would not be exempt from this, so that they would be able to go ahead in the same way. Is that a concern for you?
Let me just respond on the GRC, first of all, for somebody that gets that certificate, because it's important to know that process. There was a ruling in Northern Ireland last year, which was really about a person who was trying to seek funding to be able to go to get an opinion to allow them to apply for the GRC. To get your certificate, you need to have a psychological assessment carried out, which goes in front of the court. You also need to demonstrate that this is a full and permanent change in your life. So in Northern Ireland, we have a real life living situation where we have to prove that we have lived in our preferred gender before we can go forward for that. So the courts are not dishing out these certificates to anybody. There is still a very legal process that we have to go through, demonstrating our utility bills, demonstrating that our whole life has changed and this is a permanent change.
Yeah, the point being, though, that this is about making it easier is what the Scottish legislation is about. It's about specifically making that easier. And just, again, it's important that you address some of Maren's concerns there.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a danger, isn't there?
There's no more danger than somebody going into it, a place that is a single sex place. There is more likely to be harm to the trans person than there is to be to a cis woman, as we would refer to them, somebody that was born as female and stays as female. There's more of a risk there. If there is a sexual predator, we are protected from those sexual predators by registers, by other legislation. And for me, I would be more concerned, even from myself, going into one of those spaces. I'm more likely to be attacked than I would be to attack somebody else.
Maren?
First of all, I want to say, of course, it's true that the existing process requires medical diagnosis and is restricted to people who have a proven need for this. But what the Scottish Government is seeking to do is extend this to anybody at all. And as you have already mentioned, in Parliament yesterday, MSPs rejected all amendments aimed at safeguarding women from sexual predators using the system. So not people who identify as trans at all, but just sexual predators using the system. And yet all of those amendments were voted down. And that is a real concern to us because it sends a strong signal that safeguarding women is not something that the Scottish Government is interested to do at all. And what the problem we have with accessing single-sex spaces, such as prisons, for instance, one of the arguments always made is that there's no evidence. The law's in place in the Republic of Ireland, and there's no evidence of any issues. Women in Limerick prison, for instance, have spoken of their terror at being housed with 2 convicted sex offenders granted gender recognition certificates after their conviction. The Irish government has imposed a media blackout on this story, so much of the population will be unaware. It's an Irish group that aims to promote the best.
I have to say, I don't know the details of this, and therefore I kind of feel slightly uncomfortable with having the conversation about it, mainly not because of any other reason that I don't know the details of it, and you're claiming a media blackout, which anyway would not affect this particular jurisdiction if that existed, but I don't know that one exists in the first place. Just finally on this subject, can I ask you just to respond to one text that's come in here, Karen, and that is about the concern about young people. You talked about how important it was for young people. It says, this is the texter says, there are now many examples in schools in Northern Ireland of young people detransitioning back to their original gender. A change in the law in Scotland would likely increase young people making life-altering decisions that they could regret. It's a big decision to make. Why not allow people to make that at 18 rather than the likes of 16?
It's a very difficult decision to make, and nobody embarks on this journey unless it's something that they're really conscious and serious about. For me, the change from 18 to 16 does allow somebody to be able to start their university career in their preferred gender. I also would agree that below 16 is really, you're at a situation where you really need to have some guidance and counselling and a surety that you're making that right decision. So I wouldn't be rushing in for really young children. But
that's the safeguards which potentially are going as part of this legislation. That's the concern.
Well, I'm supportive of the age 16 as somebody that can make a decision on their future.
Karen McShane and Maren Smith, thank you both very much indeed.